Online Edition, produced by Wadena County Historical Society and Travel and Story Seller, in collaboration with New York Mills Regional Cultural Center. Bookends is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Five Wings Arts Council, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Bookends programs from previous authors are now available on the website of the Wadena County Historical Society at www.wadenacountyhistory.org. Today's program will also be available on the website shortly. This month's speaker is Geoff Herbach. Geoff is the author of the award-winning Stupid Fast young adult series, as well as Fat Boy versus the Cheerleaders. His books have been given the 2011 Cybils Award for the best young adult fiction, as well as the Minnesota Book Award. His books are listed among the year's best by the American Library Association. When he's not writing books, he teaches writing at Minnesota State, Mankato. His most recent book is Cracking the Bell. Next month's Bookends will be held Saturday, November 13th, and will feature humorist Mike Lean. Is that right? Hopefully. If not, I'm sorry. If you have questions for today's author, feel free to enter them through the chat. If you'd like to order books, you may do so through our bookseller, Travel and Story Seller at gmail.com. Now, let's welcome to Bookends Online Edition, Geoff Herbach. Welcome.
Hey, thank you. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, well, I think I'm gonna just quickly talk about how I became a young adult writer, and then maybe read a little bit, and then just open up for questions. I always sort of wanted to be a writer and wrote my whole life. So I was one of those kids who wasn't paying attention during math lessons, and I was drawing little pictures and writing stories about them. But as I got older, I really believed that there was not a possibility in the world for someone to be a writer, even though my mother was an high school English teacher, and I grew up in a small town, and so she was my high school English teacher at one point. And my dad was started out being a college professor and then ended up doing like television production. But still, I kind of thought there's no way, and it's because I got these weird messages from my parents, who clearly wanted me to be a dentist for good reason. They thought I should earn a living and be safe. Yet I remember, writing this paper when I was in high school, and it was called a career of my choice. And I was about still, 75% sure that I could be a professional football player when I was in high school, which was not, I'm deluded. I want you to just look at my face. This is not the face of a professional football player. But like 25% thought, I think maybe I'd like to be a writer. And I did this research and found out that the average American fiction writer in the late 1980s made $1,100 a year, which to me, even at the time, like, that's not bad. That's pretty good. and my mom, who is, my teacher, said, well, where are you going to live? And I said, I don't know. I'll get an apartment. And she, do you have any idea what apartments cost? And I said, I don't know, 50, 100, I don't know. And she's like, no, hundreds of dollars. And what are you going to eat? And I said, I'll get bread. And she's like, you can't afford bread. So she was nervous. But still, it's what I wanted to do. And I figured out very soon after that I would not be a professional football player, after getting very beat up in one game. And so I really started pursuing it in college, and it's kind of the same thing happened. My dad lived in Duluth when I was in college, and I went to visit him around my 21st birthday, and we were in his backyard having this, conversation. He had this really sort of like sonorous, deep voice. And he said, so Geoff, what are you going to do with your life? And I said, oh, Dad, I think I'm going to be a writer. And he made this kind of, gravelly noise. And he said, "Do you know my friend Andy?" And I was like, "No." And he's like, "Yes, Andy. Andy's been trying to publish his stories for years, and he's so depressed that he pull up to an intersection in his car and on the red, and when it turns green, he won't drive away. He'll just sit there, and the police will have to come and remove his car from the intersection." And I'm just like, because he wants to be a writer? And my dad kind of looked around and said, "Yes, yes." And then he said, and I think this man was made up. He said, "Do you know my friend Milosh?" I don't believe there was anyone named Milosh in 1990 in Duluth. But apparently Milosh had already published books and was relatively successful, but was still, because my dad said writers are depressed. Had gotten so depressed that he'd driven out of Duluth and he'd taken a right and just driven into Canada and had disappeared into Canada. And I realized, "Dad, are you telling me if I want to be a writer, there's a possibility I will disappear in Canada?" And my dad said yes. That writers are depressed. You never know what's going to happen to them. And I got a little scared, and so I started trying to do other things, but nothing really took. And I still kept writing stories on the outside. And finally, after and this is a sad story, I got fired in my mid-20s while working in journalism. And I got fired because I made up a little part of a story, and it wasn't even a critical part of the story. It was a joke that I planted in the middle of a serious story about endangered fish, believe it or not. And the editor of the magazine that I worked for said, "If you want to make up stuff all the time, just write books." And I actually had this voice in my head that said, "You'll disappear in Canada." But that was kind of it. After so much failure, I thought, okay, I'm just gonna try. And my first book took me about 7 years to write, but I did it. And after a while, I got an agent, and then I it got published, and I took it to my dad and said, "Hey, Dad, check it out. I'm a published author." And he said, "I know. I'm so proud of you." And I said, "Oh, really? Where am I?" And he said, "In my living room." And I'm like, "Yeah, and where's your living room?" And he said, "In my house." And I said, "Yeah, where's your house?" And he was like, "Okay, what are you getting at?" And I said, "Well, I'm not in Canada, am I?" And he said, "What are you talking about?" And I said, "You told me that I would disappear into Canada if I became a writer." And he looked at me and he said, "I never said that." But he did. And I think that, one of the weirdest things about the story, and kind of the funniest things that I try to talk to kids about this, that, if you have a great passion for something and it's what you do when no one's looking, and there's some kind of economic activity associated with it, and someone tells you it's a bad idea, think about it a little bit. Because it's possible my dad had a bad piece of fish or something that night and had some indigestion or something, and that's why he came up with this thing. But it really affected me, and I didn't kind of pursue what I wanted to do for years, which isn't terrible. It's probably good to mature a little bit as a writer, and I think most writers don't find their kind of wheelhouse until they hit their 30s or 40s. Young writer awards go up to 40, which is kind of freeing. So I wrote that book, and it was fine. It took 7 years, and I did think at a certain point, wow, that money that they gave me to publish this book doesn't cover 7 years very well. And how am I going to make a living? Maybe my mom's right, and I'm not going to be able to afford bread. I'd started writing comedy, though, in between with a group of friends, and writing comedy, we would sit around in the afternoon and think of the sort of dumbest things we could come up with, and then write them down, and then go and perform them that night and get paid. And so I really thought, I think I want to be a comedian. It's fun, it's dumb. I'm really kind of making 7th grade level dirty jokes and getting paid for it, which is remarkable. If you'd told me in 7th grade that I could come up with that stuff and someone would actually give me money for it, I would have been in heaven. And so that's what I thought I would do. And so our show kind of got big, and we were in Minneapolis, and we were on Minnesota Public Radio a few times, and then we moved the show to New York because one of the writers got a connection there, and then we kind of got big in New York, and we started having celebrities like Nora Jones was on our show. I still to this day cannot understand how that happened. But it was big enough to pay me money, and the problem was I had kids at that point, and not small kids, and I was flying back and forth between Minneapolis and New York doing this show, and at one point thought, maybe the kids will want to move to New York, and I took them out there and showed them the 1-bedroom apartment that I could afford. And they were used to yards and their own rooms and things that you can have in Minnesota. And my son was like, where are we going to sleep? I said, well, I will have some bedrolls. We'll pull them out from under this bed, and we'll, and he was like, no way. That 1-bedroom apartment cost $3,500 a month, and the mortgage in Minneapolis was like $950 or something at the time. I mean, it was, such a tremendous difference. So I just kept commuting, and this is what happened. It was my son. The last time I went to New York was 12 years old, and he was about 4'7", and he was real cute, and he was kind of roly-poly, and he was like, "Hi, Dad." That's how he sounded, and very endearing. And he was one of these fantasy readers. He would get a book from the school library right after school, and he would read so hard that you'd put a dinner plate in front of him, and he'd read and try to eat while reading. And I can't believe now that I said this to him, but I would say, like, stop reading, put down your book. So he'd put it on his lap, and then pretty soon his head would go down to the table, and he'd be reading underneath the table while we were eating. I mean, he was just an unstoppable reader, and a lovely nerdy kid. The last time I went to New York, and I had to go for 4 months between the middle of May and the middle of August, and in about the 3rd week that I was there, at the beginning of June, I called him, and I called him on the phone every day, and he answered the phone, and he said, "Hello, hello, hello." And I'm like, "Leo, are you okay?" And he's like, "I don't know." Do you have a cold or something? What's wrong with your voice? And he's like, "I don't know." 2 days later, I called, and he answered the phone, and he said, "Hello." "Leo, is that?" He's like, "Yes." I mean, "You sound like a man." And he's like, "I know." I mean, the bottom dropped out of his voice so quickly. It was amazing. And then he started texting me pictures of his pants because he was growing so quickly, that he actually would say, "These pants fit me a day ago. Now they are an inch too short." And I'd have a picture of his ankle hanging out from underneath his pants. And it was a remarkable growth spurt. And I guess when I talk to middle school kids, I can say to them, have you ever grown so fast that your body hurts, that your knees hurt and your hips hurt and your shins hurt? And they all, I think we forget as adults how painful it is when you go through those spurts. So he was having those kinds of growing pains. And I thought, wow, I'm missing my son grow up. And why is it that I'm missing my son grow up? It's because I'm writing kind of dirty jokes. That's what I'm doing. That's what I'm giving my life to. And so, by the end of July, I went to the producer of the show and said, "I don't think I can do this anymore. I'm done. I don't want to miss my children growing up." I had a daughter who was 9 at that time too. And I quit. And in August, I flew back home, and I took a really early flight, and landed in Minneapolis. And I got back to the house at like 9:30 in the morning. And my daughter was on the couch, and she was happy to see me. And I said, yeah, where's Leo? And she said, oh, he never gets up anymore. And this was a kid who would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to finish the book so he could take it to school and get another book, and at 10 o'clock, he wasn't awake. At 11 o'clock, finally at noon, I pounded on the door upstairs and I'm like, Leo, can you come down and see me? I haven't seen you. And I heard this sort of Frankenstein, like, bah! And these steps across the ceiling. And he came downstairs, and instead of saying, hi, Dad, he said, what's up? And he was skinny and long. And what happened is in the space of 4 months, he grew 6 inches, and just like explosively fast. And I brought a bunch of books home from New York with me that I'd bought at the Strand bookstore, this like really great bookstore in Greenwich Village. And I handed him to him, and he looked at him and put them aside, and he said, books don't apply to me. I was like, what do you mean? And he said, books don't apply to me. I said, but books are everything. How can they not apply to you? And he's like, nah, I don't want to read them. And that concerned me a lot. It just freaked me out because it was such sort of a central value in my house, that, we would all be readers, and that's something that we shared. And here's my son, nah. 2 weeks later, I was sitting there unemployed, having quit my job, and kind of wondering what I was going to do, if not to write dirty jokes. And about 11 o'clock in the morning, Leo came stomping down the stairs, and he came into the living room and said, Dad, do you smell something? And I said, yeah. And he said, what is it? And I said, I don't know. And there was like just a weird acrid smell. So we did that thing that you do when you smell something weird in your house and you have to find it. You don't want to, but you have to, otherwise it will fester. And I started sniffing kind of through the living room, and Leo went sniffing through the kitchen, and we did this sort of figure 8 thing. And when he passed my left, I was like, and I said, Leo, it's you. And he said, what? And he lifted his arm. He's like, oh! It was his left armpit. And he raised his right armpit, and he's like, this one's fine. Oh, this one's terrible. I'm like, oh, well, I guess the left side of your body went through puberty last night. And he said, what are you talking about? I'm like, that's the smell that you get when you're growing up. And he's like, that's disgusting. So he said, well, we'll go to Target. We drove to Target together to get his first deodorant. And I felt really proud because, it was a father and son moment after missing a few over the summer. But at Target, one of the workers with the red shirts came up to us and said, can I help you find something? And I said, oh, well, my son's left armpit went through puberty last night. And Leo's like, shut up. And it just cracked me up. So we got the deodorant, and all the way home, Leo was saying, oh, this one is terrible. This one's fine. This one's terrible. It killed me. And when I got home, I thought, I kind of want to write a little story about a kid who grows really fast and smells funky. And so I sat down and I wrote about 500 words. And this never happens as a writer, but they ended up being the beginning of the second chapter of this book, Stupid Fast. And these are the words. This is not altered at all from what I wrote that morning. So it's chapter 2, My Body Grew Hair is the original text in this. And it says, I am not stupid funny. I am stupid fast. My last name is Reinstein, which is not a fast name. But last November, while I was a sophomore, my voice finally dropped, and I grew all this hair on my legs and other places. And then I got stupid fast. I'm serious. Before my voice dropped in the fall, when my class was outside for gym, I played flag football and felt like trying for some reason. I was pretty good because even though I hadn't yet fully gone through puberty like all the chuckleheads in my grade and never tried before and wasn't even interested in the slightest, I've always been good at sports, a fact I hid by not trying, but not ridiculously good. Then Thanksgiving came, and I couldn't stop eating, and I couldn't wake up before like noon, which drove my mom Jerry nuts, and I grew taller, and I got all this crazy hair. The hair was like corn coming up in June. You look one day and there are sprouts in the dirt, but mostly you see dirt. And then like a week later, those sprouts aren't sprouts, but are corn and are already knee high, and you can't see the dirt at all. I ate too much at Thanksgiving, about 1,000 pounds, and I couldn't wake up in the morning, and I sprouted hair. A week later, I had 1,000 pounds of hair everywhere. Then, because my voice dropped, I got moved to baritone for the Christmas concert, which was bad news because I didn't know the parts at all. So I sang the tenor parts, except an octave below, which you could totally hear. And it went on. I kept sleeping and eating, and Jerry yelled at me to get out of bed. And I yelled at my little brother Andrew to stop playing the piano so I could sleep. So Jerry yelled at me for yelling at Andrew, and I'd get mad and get out of bed and go to the refrigerator and stuff bread in my mouth because I was so hungry. Then Jerry would yell at me for eating too fast, and Andrew would shout, "Fountain's a pig!" and on all winter. My pants getting too short, my shirts looking shrunken, not covering my belly button, which is gross. Jess Withrow and Abby Sauter told me it was gross. And Jerry and Andrew shouting at me, and me shouting back. Jerry never yelled before November. I got to the R on that November, and I thought, oh, this is much bigger than a little short story, because I could see all these things shooting out. For some reason, I knew that the dad wasn't there. And I knew I could see the mom real clearly because I was based her on this woman named Wendy who lived down the street from me when I was a kid. And she had all these bells sewn into her skirt. So when she walked around, you hear this jingle, jingle, jingle. And all her kids called her Wendy instead of mom, like the kids were calling their mom Jerry. And she'd make these sprout sandwiches with like cream cheese and like wheat bread this thick and some sprouts on it, and you'd eat it and it just like get all stuck in your mouth. And I thought that's her. And I just I knew that this kid was ridiculously fast. He was an athlete and he didn't know why. And I had this other experience that earlier in the spring with one of my friends from high school. And he told me, I remember when you went through puberty and you got real fast. It was so weird. And I thought, I'm just going to write my story, and I'm going to write my hometown into it. And I'm going to make it much more dramatic than my whole life was, but it's going to be real tied in there. And I'm going to do everything in this book that I know Leo cares about. And Leo's big loves were sports, piano, and we couldn't go to the mall without him falling in love with someone. So I thought I'm going to have all three of those things in this book, and it's going to be, real dramatic. And it took me about 6 weeks to write the first draft of it. And I sent it to Leo over email because he didn't want it printed out. He said he wanted to read it on his iPod, which I thought was dumb. But he didn't have a phone yet, but it was one of those iPods with the screens on it. And he read it on his iPod. And at the end, he said, "That was pretty good. Could you write another?" And I thought, yes, I think I will. I was so excited that he read it. I was about halfway into the second one when I thought, I wonder, I still had an agent from the first book. I wonder if this is anything. And so I sent him the first one, and he wrote back right away. And he said, "Oh, you've written a YA book." And I said, "No, I have not. There are no wizards in it." Because I assumed at the time, I had no idea what YA was. I assumed it had to be magical somehow. And my agent said, no, there's all kinds of YA books. And so that book became my first YA. And I think I've written 8 since then, over time. And what's so funny to me is that they really were like literally inspired by my son's left armpit, which, when you hear about what is divine inspiration, well, one morning, and I have not gotten remotely rich, of course, doing this, because they are books intended for kids who are having a hard time reading, because they don't necessarily see what they love in the books. So I'm writing for kids who don't like to read. So I have been really dependent on great booksellers and librarians to get them into the world, because they're not prized at the retail level. Yeah, so that's sort of the story of how I got to do what I do, and I'd love to take any questions that you might have.
Does Anybody? I'm trying to scramble now because I was gonna say, well, what got you into kids' books? But left armpit. So there's that question.
There it is. Yeah.
um, what got you into teaching writing?
Well, it's funny. So I got, I had an MFA and I was doing that comedy writing and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. And I wrote this book, Stupid Fast, at the same time that Terry Davis, who wrote a book called Vision Quest in the 1980s, which was about wrestling. And, it became a movie with like Madonna in it. He was retiring from Minnesota State Mankato. And so a job popped up as I was just starting to look around in Minnesota, where it said, we're very interested in people who are doing comedy writing and young adult writing. And I thought, oh my God, I've never seen that job description anyplace. And it really was, it was like tailor-made for me. And shocking, it's hard to get these jobs, but I applied and got it. And I really wasn't quite sure what I was going to do. And I had taught a little bit, sort of, composition at community colleges to make ends meet in between. And this is remarkable. And I love teaching. I love it dearly. Yeah. So it just feels lucky. Yeah.
Cool. So you're still in Minneapolis now, right?
I actually live in St. Peter and work in Mankato. So I'm 12 miles north of Mankato. Yeah. I can see Gustavus out my window. That's
cool.
Yeah. And I've been here for about 12 years.
Wow. Yeah, I worked as a bookseller at Barnes & Noble for 12 years. Also helped Gillette out too at her bookstore. But yeah, we really enjoyed, like, sometimes the ones writing for middle grade and young adults were much better books. Do you find that it's easier to write for kids? Like, you can deal with more stuff because it's not adult fiction?
Yeah, I'm not entirely sure. I wrote, as I said, my first book was for adults, and it took me a long time to write. I think I learned a little bit about what not to do when writing that. The characters in middle grade and YA tend to be pretty complex, and the situations are complex. What I like about, what I've really enjoyed about doing YA is I write that coming of age narrative arc, again and again and again. And so I always know that at the end, there's going to be some sort of like really good lesson learned that I believe in, that makes me feel better about having written a bunch of jokes for middle schoolers throughout the book, because there's a nice lesson at the end. That's a candy, wrapped around it. And so I always have felt like I know what the target of the book is, and that to me is easy. I also think that's the reason that a lot of adults enjoy reading young adult and middle grade titles, is that there is like a real understandable direction that they're going in, and it meets their sort of genre expectations. Yeah,
I find too that kids that age, everything is dramatic. There's like, it seems like that's the most dramatic period in your life, where everything is just huge. Like now at 50, you're like, yeah, whatever.
This is my first lesson that I give when I teach YA writing, is I say, okay, imagine if I said, I need to get a breath of fresh air, and I'm going to walk out the door, and I'll be back in 2 minutes. And when I go out the door, a crazy guy jumps out of the bush and punches me in the face. If I came back in after that just happening, how would I talk to you about it? And kids are like, oh, you of course you'd be freaking out, right? You'd be saying, oh my God, a guy just jumped out of the bush and punched me in the face. And that's sort of the vibe of YA, generally speaking. It's the first time something big happens in your life, right? You've never experienced it before. And then if you're writing that from an adult perspective, like it happened 10 years ago, I would say, remember that weird time in my life where every time I stepped out of a building, a man would jump out of a bush and punch me in the face? I realized then that that's a lot like life, isn't it? Like it becomes this, when there's reflective distance and you can say, I understand what's happening. The teenagers who are just experiencing that have no way to make sense of it. There's no context for it. So yeah, it's amped up, and I enjoy that voice a lot too. Yeah.
Cool. Do you do events at schools or bookstores for young adults, kids?
Yeah. It's the last one I did was March 7th of 2020. Uh, it was a real weird, like the news was just breaking and I was visiting schools around Chicago. And I thought, should I go to the breakfast buffet? Has someone sneezed in it or something? Yeah, but so I have. It's been a couple of years. I've just started getting invitations for the spring for in-person stuff. I'm not quite sure yet if I want to be in person. I've done some Zoom stuff in places in between, but yeah, it's best for me if I go to schools for sure, because as I said, the I can put up giant posters all over town and 14-year-old boys will not show up at the library for me. Very upset with them. They just won't do it.
Yeah, the last time I think we had one of these events was in March.
Okay. Yeah.
It's been very weird because it's so nice to get to meet people.
Yeah.
In person, have lunch after, and
it's
see
lovely.
everybody.
I miss it a ton. Yeah.
So do you ever have plans to do another adult book at all in the future, or you're just going to stick with YA?
My wife and I, during the pandemic, wrote a draft of a mystery. And sort of it's real goofy. I don't know if it's too goofy for the market. Right now, mysteries are real dead serious for the most part. So I don't know if it will ever find a place, but it was a ball. She published a book that was a Minnesota Book Award finalist a few years ago called The Annie Year. And so she's a great writer too. And so we collaborated on this thing, and it was such a joy. I assume we'll be doing more of those. Yeah. If we have to revise this one. It's hard when we're both kind of at each other's throats a little bit on the revision process. So that's gone slower.
Yeah.
At each other's throats, that's a little strong. We complain to each other.
Well, yeah, it's hard to be like quarantined together with people.
Yeah. It was great in a lot of ways. I mean, it was a joy. I don't know. Did you all enjoy the quarantine a little bit? I had a mixed experience. Sometimes I thought, wow, it's awesome not having to go anyplace.
Well, I live alone and I'm something of an introvert, but I work with animals now. So I had to keep going to work because dogs don't feed themselves.
No, they're not.
Yeah.
Yep.
The opposable thumb thing. You can't get the can. They would happily eat their way through an entire bag of food in one day though, but
yes,
they can't get the cans open. So, and they don't clean up after themselves, kind of like teenagers.
Yeah, that's right. Our youngest child is now 18. So the son who I was talking about he's already graduated from college and reads big, thick Russian novels now. So he went back to reading. Yeah. But yeah, our youngest is 18, but we did immediately stupidly get a lab who is, acts like a drunk toddler.
Yeah. Oh, sorry. I have those moments where I have something in my head, but I'm doing like talking about something else. I'm like, I'll get back to that. And then I go back and I'm like, where did it go?
Yeah.
Oh, you said something about the mystery having comedy. Have you read like David Rosenfeld's his like mystery series, Andy Carpenter series? That's kind
I'm
of
writing it down. Okay.
So he uses humor in his mysteries a little bit, so it's kind of funny. I personally would like to see more drama with humor in it, because in real life, usually at those worst moments, a lot of us find humor helps us,
Yeah.
keep from going
Yeah.
insane or pulling a gun and taking out everybody at the mall.
Yeah. Yeah, that I think so too. And it's certainly it's my coping mechanism. So I would assume it's lots of people's as well. Yeah. So we'll see. We shared an agent on it, and she's given us lots of notes. And she's not sure about the tone of it. The tone is a little weird. So we'll have to see. In any case, we learned, and if we have to write another one to get it right, that'll be okay too. Yeah.
Cool. Will be interesting to see if that comes out. Then we can read it and have you
Yeah, it'd
back.
be
Talk
great.
about that with your wife.
It's Minnesota. It's a fake Brainerd Lakes area. So
Cool.
yeah.
Well, if Frederick Bachman can, even through translation, survive having a lot of humor
Oh man.
in dealing with serious subjects.
Yeah.
I mean, and it seems
Amazing.
almost unintentional, and he makes you laugh and cry. So I
Yeah.
think it's out there. There's an audience for it.
I did just probably 6 weeks ago read Anxious People, and I just love it. It's so good. And it does have a crime at the middle of it, but a real goofy people trying to pull it off. But yeah, it does. It makes you bawl and laugh at the same time. It's so good. Yeah, I love Frederick Bachman. Yeah. I wish American publishers would pick that up. They have no trouble taking a Swedish guy and publishing his stuff. Yeah.
And his humor survives translation.
Yes.
So why? I mean, he just the art of being able to put people in a situation where the writing of it is humorous, but the larger thing that you're thinking about is very serious, what you're addressing. There's another book too, and it was talking about Alzheimer's and aging and senior care, and it was awesome. And I'll come up with the title and I'll put it in chat.
Cool. Great. Thank you. Yeah. So this is the best situation I can imagine. I'm getting good book titles from from this. Is really good. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you find sometimes like the business of publishing, especially in this country, because I noticed, like you were saying, there's no wizards in your YA, and for a while there I was lamenting that it was I liked middle reader better than YA because it was all vampires, like vampire and zombies, and you're like, really, seriously, is there nothing but vampires? I mean, having spent time with Gillette's Sons, I can see where you'd think kids that age are vampires and zombies. It just, it feels like somebody does something that's successful, and then there's a push to have everybody sort of, this is what works, and it takes a while for somebody to have the courage to put out something different to people go, oh, thank God.
Yeah.
Something else.
Yeah. It is. YA is difficult, and it is because it is that follow the leader domination, and so you can. I've already seen it over the last like 11 years where, at the beginning, like Stupid Fast was clearly in when it came out, and then that kind of thing went out for a while, and then there was like a little bubble where like, oh, we need more books for boys, and then like you shouldn't have books just focused on boys, like these arguments go back and forth, and it's weird how much the sort of editorial in part of the industry reacts to sort of cultural changes, and they're chasing the dollar, and I can understand it. That's how they make their money, but it's frustrating, and I wish there would just be a recognition that there's a really broad audience and there needs to be support from lots of different kinds of books, because there's no such thing as sort of a monolithic teenager. Teenagers are everybody. Yeah.
Yeah. I always thought it was interesting that we'd have books that there were two. I always saw it as two kinds of books. There were the ones that came out as bestsellers, generally written by James Patterson, and they would be bestsellers for a week or two until all his fans bought it and then disappear. And then there was other books that would start out quiet, and the next thing you know, they're on the bestseller list still in hardcover like 2 years later, because a few people took a chance and read it and then said, oh, you have to read this book. And then the next thing you know, everybody has to read that book. I think as an author, you'd almost really rather write the second kind of book.
Oh my gosh, yes. And it's so much better to have really great word of mouth, and then it has staying power. If it's a publisher just throwing a lot of money around during the initial marketing of it, it doesn't really matter a whole lot. So yeah, much better to have written a really great thing that people start to talk about. That's what I would hope for. I've never really experienced that, but that's what I would hope for. If ever I were to have like one of those kind of skyrocket successes, that second model you were talking about is amazing. And yeah, and I feel like that's the Frederick Bachman model as well, that these are not books that I heard about right when they came out or right when they were translated, but slowly over time they kind of seeped to me, and now most of the people I know have read at least one of his books. Yeah.
What were some of the books that inspired you when you were young? Like, what were some of your favorite books as a kid?
Oh, I was a giant Kurt Vonnegut reader when I was in high school. And I really liked the humor. He's somebody who deals with very difficult issues with a whole bunch of humor and sort of like tenderness for this people who are making absurd choices in their lives, and a great deal of, I guess, anger towards powerful people who are doing nasty things. So he really spoke to me. I right out of high school, there were young writers like I don't know what is Dave Eggers, who I really adored when I was in my early 20s. But there were like people say there weren't really YA books, but I had Chocolate War and A Separate Peace, and my mother, when I stopped reading, my mother said, oh, I know who you are now, and she gave me Catcher in the Rye, and I was like, oh yes, I recognize this guy. So luckily I had a high school English teacher for a mother, so that when I hit that stage where suddenly the fantasy books that I had read, kind of like my son, stopped speaking to me, she immediately handed me 25 different titles to get me back into it. So I never really had a break in there where I wasn't reading. The Outsiders, was a big deal to me. Yeah, I think this.
Yeah, some of the Judy Blume books were kind of skewed a little older.
They did. Yeah, I love them. I loved them when I was a kid too. The the Peter books and Sheila books, that Tales of a Fourth Grade Nothing, and otherwise known as Sheila the Great. Those were those are the books where you realize, oh man, a strong voice in a character can carry a book, because the kids' voices in those books are just so powerful and so funny, so smart. Yeah.
Oh yeah. I loved like the E.B. White ones, and they were just anything about kids having adventures. I noticed when I grew up in the 70s, there was a big spate of books where the kids were orphaned. Like, orphans were big,
big time. It just, yeah, like the Boxcar Children, is that the it's whenever I teach that YA class, again, I always say, what happens to the parents of a kid in these books? and either they disappear from their own frailty, or they've been murdered. They got to wipe out the parents somehow so the kids can have some agency.
Yeah. It's interesting. Now, of course, you can always add divorce too, and
Yes.
and all kinds of other stuff. But back then it was like, nope, they have to be gone completely. So you're a tragic little orphan running through the world.
Yeah. I've never written a book for kids where the parents are still together. So you're exactly right.
Cool. So what are you working on now? What's your newest book?
Oh, well, I am working on a book called Maeve and Marty Go to Hardee's. It's a trip, a brother and a sister go to Hardee's. That's that's the goal, the whole thing. It's a lot happens on the way to Hardee's, and they're looking for a brother who got lost in addiction and seems to potentially be working at this Hardee's 300 miles from their hometown. So it's a road trip book, and the brother and sister really dislike each other. So it's been fun to, I mean, they love each other, of course, but it's been fun to write the dialogues of their real wicked fights as it comes together. So we'll see. I'm not quite sure yet where it's going. So we'll see. That means it's probably not going to come out for a couple of years.
Do you want to read something for us from one of your books?
Sure.
A little bit more. We'd love to hear the author read.
Yeah, this is my least popular book. And it's interesting. So it's called Anything You Want, and this is one where and I understand the publisher changed the title from This Taco is a Keeper to Anything You Want, because they wanted to, there's sort of a romance in it, and I think they were thought, oh, maybe we can move Herbach beyond just appealing to kids who don't want to read. So they put one of those, the grass, lying in the grass covers, and people really who wanted the romance and bought it because of that, they hate it. They hate this book so much. And it's one of my favorites, so it's kind of sad to me. But what I really like about it is it's just, the kid is suffering mightily, and but he is in love with life so hard. He just loves life, and he is excited by everything and doesn't really notice how badly he's suffering. It takes a lot to sort of pierce him. So this is when he started falling in love, and he's just a goofball. When did it start? Duh, dingus, last spring. Last spring, I decided I was completely emotionally ready for. So I asked Maggie Corrigan to the prom, and she said, boom. And she poked her finger into the middle of my chest. I said, boom? That's good, right? That's a yes? Maggie Corrigan is intense. She's wild and crazy and intense. And I had to be prepared for all that she can be. We stood in the hall at school, leaned up against a locker as a bunch of freshmen, a total wad of screaming monkeys, ran by on their way to gym. Maggie shouted, yeah, for sure, Taco, boom. She poked me again. What? I shouted back because I couldn't hear her over the freshmen. I totally want to go to prom with you. Really? I shouted back. Then she grabbed my face and pulled my ears, so my head came down to her face, and she French kissed me right there in front of all those freshmen. She kissed my ass off. My pants almost exploded from my body because she kissed me so hard. She's spontaneous like that. I knew that then, but not like I know now. And you know what? It doesn't matter because I love her. I think I've loved Maggie Corrigan since before time. In a past life, I was probably the court clown, and she was probably the crazy Queen of Holland, and I'm pretty sure we were doing it behind the king's back. If we weren't doing it, we were probably going on long, naked walks in the forest, where we stroked unicorns and lay on the dewy moss to gaze upon the sky. All the freshman monkeys in the hall started shouting stuff like, get a room and more tongue. Freshmen are pretty funny. I've always liked them. That day will go down in history for sure. I really needed Maggie Corrigan's energy and love right about then. The year before Maggie kissed my ass off, Mom died. 6 months after Mom died, Dad took a job driving trucks at a mine up north because we needed more money to float the boat. 2 months after Dad left for the mine, Darius, my older brother, got a drunk driving ticket, which he said he didn't deserve because he only had like 2 beers after work. It's just that his blood doesn't register alcohol like a normal people's blood because it's a mix of O positive and A negative, which is rare. So the cops didn't know what they were doing when they gave him a breathalyzer. Okay, that didn't exactly make sense to me, but that's good old Darius. Anyway, he lost his Pepsi product truck delivery route and went to work at Captain Stabby's, this fish sandwich place, for about half the money. Dude smelled like fish 24/7. So things were crap, and I began to lose the pep in my cucumber. I was seriously beginning to think my mom was wrong and everything about everything, and maybe life really is terrible, like Darius always said. But then I spent a few weeks following Maggie Corrigan around school and saw how she laughed until she fell on the floor, screamed when she got mad at her friends, cried when she was sad about the basketball team losing, and smiled so hard it looked like her face might break when I told her I liked her handwriting. After that, I thought, that's what Mom was talking about. Life is beautiful. And so I summoned my good feelings and my optimism, and I asked Maggie to prom. A week later, we were boyfriend and girlfriend and going at it in the hall every day between classes. Literally, going at it. It's just a goofy voice. And it makes me real happy. His name is Taco, and his brother, he ends up taking really good care of his brother. So he's the keeper of his brother, and that's why it was this Taco as a keeper. Yeah, I like that title a lot for it, and I wish it had stayed.
Yeah. You don't always have a lot of control over the titles, though, do you, as the author?
No, yeah, it's interesting. You can really, your titles are suggestions, and then it goes to a committee, and they make, I think the choice that they made was super rational. That they were trying to bust this out to a different market, and but I like this Taco as a keeper much better. The original cover had him face down on the ground as well, and it that made a lot of sense to me too.
Yeah. And how do you keep your voice through the editing process? Like how do you keep them? Do they allow you, basically, like, if there's something you really wanted in there, can you fight for it? Or
Yeah, most of the time, like the editor of this book, she was really great, and she we had lots of conversations about the weird choices that I was making for the character, and the weird things that he was saying. But she genuinely supported if I could explain why I was doing what I was doing, and she understood. She would accept it, and it really was things like cover, like the marketing stuff.
Yeah.
I lost control of, but the actual content of the book, the editor and I worked really wonderfully together on. Yeah.
Cool. And what about your newest book, Cracking the Bell?
Yeah, so Cracking the Bell is a football book, and it is well, something I've kind of struggled with, that going back to this guy who came to me a few years ago and said, remember when you went through, when you grew really fast in like 8th grade and you suddenly became a good athlete? And I did. I don't know. It really happened. And I was an absolute just gargantuan mess in middle school. I could not study. I could not concentrate. I was so jumpy. People actually threatened to beat me up constantly because I was bouncing up and down and making weird noises. And I was just a really rattled middle school kid. And something about football sort of took it out of me. It was like everything got channeled. It was incredibly difficult, and it was something that I had to work on all the time. It regulated my schedule. I'd get up very early in the morning, and lift weights or work out every day before school. When I started having sort of my flinchy kinds of aspirations, I would actually think, oh, I don't want to get in trouble and not be able to play football. So it really channeled everything for me. During high school, I got 3 concussions, and one of them was significant, where like the sky started like spinning like a tornado, and I heard these like really high pitched whistles in my ears. And I couldn't stand up, and I threw up a bunch that night. And I was lucky that I recovered from them quickly, although you never know. These things are things that could come back and haunt you later. And so there's been so much talk about the danger of football, and yet in some ways I feel like it was the one thing that could put me on track in high school. And so this is a book where a kid is kind of in the same circumstance, where it's kind of saved his life, and he's had a 3rd concussion. And we know a lot more about what concussions do to you now than we did then, and he's having to make a choice. He's got scholarship offers and things. What is he going to do? And it's kind of a philosophical book about football. And the sad part is, I've talked to a lot of football players about it, and they're like, I didn't want to read that. I didn't want to have those thoughts. So I think it's a weird book. He does end up playing a final game and then deciding that he's done. After he plays that game, he's figures that he can apply those things that he's learned to the rest of his life without endangering himself. So, but I'm not particularly anti-football. I feel like, in doing research about it, it's much more dangerous for kids to drive. There's so many things in the world that are far more dangerous for kids than playing this sport, which it's got its dangers. And if you don't do it, of course, you probably aren't going to get hit in the head. But, after, I feel like I should never have given my children driver's licenses when they were 17 years old, 16, 17, after doing the research. They're in much greater danger. So it is kind of like him balancing out those things. And so because it's fiction, I put in that his sister was killed in a car accident several years before it, which sort of started a downward spiral in his family. So it's a meditation, and it's much less funny than all my other books, although there's one extremely comic character. So I tried to have a little bit of candy in there. Yeah.
Well, yeah, even Shakespeare had his comic relief in his tragedies. So there you go.
Yeah. Thank you for the Shakespeare reference. I would.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, is there any other questions as we wind down?
I haven't looked at chat at all. Is there anything in there that? Oh, okay.
Well, I've been kind of watching and feeding the questions into my own. So, but we're hoping when COVID is over to get all the authors to come up and have an event and meet everybody and sign books and stuff like that. So hopefully you will join us then too.
Is New York Mills the place that has the philosopher debate?
That's New York Mills, yes.
Yeah.
The Great American Think-Off.
The Great American Think-Off. So I want to, that's your area, isn't it? Yeah. So I've been meaning to visit for a long time. I would love to come up. Yeah.
I think the deadline is April 1 to submit something.
Oh, okay.
You look it up on their website.
Okay. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, thanks you for coming. It was great. And I look forward to reading future books and hopefully that mystery, because mystery is one of my favorite genres. And I hope you keep the comedy in, because I think even at the worst of times, a lot of people's survival mechanism is indeed humor. And it kind of, I don't know, I like comedy in my drama.
All right. So, well, then good. We're going to keep working on it. Get it right.
All right.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And thanks for everybody for coming.
Appreciate it. Bye-bye.
Bye.